When Italy was unified in 1861, only about 2.5% of the population actually spoke Standard Italian. The government had created a country, but the citizens inside it did not yet exist. They had to be manufactured afterward, through decades of standardized schooling and a shared national language. This is not an Italian problem. This is how every country on Earth works. For roughly 290,000 years, the concept of a country did not exist. There were no borders, no passports, no anthems. You belonged to your family, not to a shape on a map. So what changed, and why? The answer starts with a limitation inside your skull. In 1992, evolutionary psychologist Robin Dunbar found a hard ceiling on the number of stable relationships a human brain can maintain. That ceiling is about 150 people. Below it, a group runs on gossip and memory. You know who to trust, who owes you a favor, and who has been stealing more than their share. Social order is automatic. Above 150, the system breaks. You cannot track that many debts, alliances, and reputations. And yet modern countries contain millions of people. Something had to replace gossip. The question is what? The first piece appeared around 12,500 BC in the Levant. A group called the Natufian culture stopped walking. Excavations by Dorothy Girard and Jean Perrot uncovered permanent stone houses and formal cemeteries at these sites. The critical detail is that these people were not farmers. They were still hunter-gatherers who had chosen to stay in one place. That single decision changed the meaning of land. For a nomadic group, land is a path. For a settled group, land is an investment, and investments need protection. Archaeologist Colin Renfrew argued in 1973 that ancient megalithic tombs were among the earliest territorial markers. The first borders were not fences or walls, they were graves. Burying your ancestors in the ground was a way of saying, "This soil is made of our dead, it belongs to us." Graves could mark territory for a family, maybe a few hundred people. They could not unite thousands of strangers who had never met each other. For that, you needed a completely different invention. In 1995, archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began excavating a site in Turkey called Göbekli Tepe. It dates to roughly 9,500 BC, thousands of years before the pyramids or Stonehenge. The site contained massive carved limestone pillars, some weighing 10 tons, and hunter-gatherers built it. Schmidt concluded that the desire to gather for shared rituals actually preceded the invention of cities. Shared belief was the technology that broke through Dunbar's ceiling. You might not know the other 10,000 people at the temple, but if you all worship the same force, you can cooperate without needing to personally trust each individual. Settlement gave humans territory. Belief gave humans scale. But neither of those created a government. The ingredient that turned cooperation into a state was a plant. Around 10,000 BC, humans in the Fertile Crescent began domesticating grain. Geneticist Manfred Hoon traced the origins of domesticated einkorn wheat to an area strikingly close to Göbekli Tepe. Political scientist James C. Scott raised a question that most historians had overlooked. Early governments formed around grain. They never formed around root vegetables like yams or cassava. Why? Because yams grow underground. You can dig them up in secret whenever you want. Grain grows above ground, ripens all at once, and can be easily measured, divided, and stored. Grain is visible, predictable, and countable. In other words, grain is the perfect thing to tax. This is where the story shifts. Up to this point, everything humans invented was about solving a cooperation problem. From here forward, every invention is about controlling people. Scott argues that the earliest form of the state was essentially a grain taxing syndicate, and the moment you have a mountain of stored food, you have a target that needs protecting. By 8000 BC, the settlement of Jericho had erected a stone wall and a tower standing 8.5 meters high. Building it required an estimated 11,000 person-days of labor. That is not something a family organizes. That requires leadership, scheduling, and a system for feeding workers while they work. At the Dara site in Jordan, dating to 9,300 BC, archaeologists Ian Coit and Bill Finlayson found elevated granaries designed to keep food safe from rodents. The person who controlled that granary controlled the population that depended on it. For tens of thousands of years, hunter-gatherer societies had used mockery and social pressure to prevent anyone from gaining too much power. Anthropologists Kent Flannery and Joyce Marcus documented this pattern in detail. But once ambitious individuals figured out how to monopolize the food surplus, permanent inequality became possible for the first time. Surplus needed to be tracked, and you cannot track 40,000 people's grain rations with memory and gossip. By 3100 BC, the city of Uruk in Mesopotamia had 40,000 residents. To manage them, they invented writing. Researcher Denise Schmont-Besserat traced the earliest proto-cuneiform tablets and found that over 85% of them were not stories or letters. They were administrative records, grain shipments, livestock counts, labor rations. The first written words were probably numbers next to pictures of barley. Uruk was also mass-producing a standardized ceramic bowl. Archaeologists Hans Nissen and Gregory Johnson realized it was a ration container. Every worker received the same bowl, filled with the same amount of grain. Writing and standardized containers together formed the world's first payroll system. The state could now feed people, track what it gave them, and know exactly what they owed in return. This was not the only path. The Indus Valley Civilization, flourishing around 2600 BC, covered a territory larger than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. Every construction brick across more than 1,000 kilometers followed an identical ratio. Yet archaeologists like Gregory Possel and Jonathan Mark Canoyer have found no royal palaces and no statues of rulers. The Indus Valley may have been governed through merchant networks and shared economic standards. A social contract written not in laws, but in the geometry of identical bricks. Whether through kings or commerce, these expanding territories inevitably collided. Anthropologist Robert Carneiro proposed a theory called environmental circumscription. In places where fertile land is surrounded by desert or mountains, like the Nile Valley, the losers of a war have nowhere to run. They are absorbed into the victor's territory. States grew by swallowing each other. Around 2500 BC, the Sumerian city-states of Lagash and Umma fought over a fertile strip of land. A boundary stele was erected to mark the line between them. When Umma crossed it, King Eannatum of Lagash crushed them and recorded his victory on the stele of the vultures, inscribing curses against anyone who moved the border again. One of the first political boundaries in recorded history was enforced by violence and maintained by threats carved in stone. Through walls, grain, writing, and war, kingdoms were built. But a kingdom is still not a modern country. Kingdoms belong to kings. A country requires millions of ordinary people to feel like they all belong to the same thing. In 1983, Benedict Anderson called this an imagined community. The printing press allowed millions of strangers to read the same news in the same language at the same time. That shared experience created the feeling of a unified public. Ernest Gellner argued that nations are not natural things people discover. They are built deliberately, through standardized education and a common language. Italy unified first and then had to turn its population into Italians. The French Revolution pushed this further. In 1793, mass military conscription was introduced. A country was no longer a place where you paid tax on your grain. It had become an identity you could be ordered to die for. Many of these identities were drawn arbitrarily. In 1916, Sykes-Picot drew lines across the Middle East without consulting the people who lived there. In 1884, European diplomats at the Berlin Conference carved up Africa without inviting a single African leader. The youngest widely recognized country, South Sudan, was established in 2011. In 1882, philosopher Ernest Renan tried to answer what a nation actually is. His conclusion was that a nation is a daily vote. It only exists because the people waking up inside its borders agree, every morning, to act as though it exists. Renan also observed that keeping this agreement alive requires a massive amount of collective forgetting. We have to ignore the conquests, the accidents, and the arbitrary lines that put us all in the same box. Every layer of a country was invented to solve a problem the previous layer created. Settlement created territory. Territory required belief. Belief enabled surplus. Surplus demanded control. Control needed bureaucracy. Bureaucracy drew borders. Borders required armies. And armies required millions of people who believed the lines were worth dying for. A passport is younger than pottery, younger than agriculture, younger than the concept of a pet dog. And it holds together only as long as enough people keep believing the story.